Hey, so...
Do you guys ever think about dying?
Like, seriously. Because it's there, right? From dust you were created, and to dust you shall one day return, and all that jazz. Like, we're all going to die one day. Does that ever just hit you suddenly? I think the first time it ever really occurred to me was when I was 5, sitting in the car on the way to kindergarten. Parts of that memory are fuzzy, and others are so clear. I think my mom was either mad at me or annoyed by any of my many shitty behaviors as a child. I don't really know. I just know she wasn't talking to me, and it was a boring-ass morning, and I just remember staring out the window of the car, watching all the trees pass by as we rounded the corner, and I saw this little cross. The memorial ones that mark where someone died in a car crash. I just stared at it. And as we passed by and it disappeared, it occurred to me that there was a time when I did not exist. A time when I just wasn't. It was weird. The first time I really understood my mortality, shackled by the burden of that awareness, an awareness my tiny baby brain couldn't fully process. In the nearly decade and a half since, these thoughts haven't gone away, obviously. Once you have that realization, once you open that bag, there's no going back. You can't erase that idea, return to a world where you just exist without having to acknowledge your eventual end. The safety blanket is gone. When I was a kid, I remember sitting on the playground as my friends and I fantasized about what would be our last meal if we were on death row. To this day, just scrolling through Instagram, I still see people recreating the last meals of famous inmates. And of course, true crime is as popular as ever. Just a year ago, Netflix's Dahmer series took over the internet, and people still think it's fun to dress up as real-life murderers or their victims for Halloween. In part, it feels almost gut-wrenchingly disgusting. How can we bring ourselves to revel so much in the pain and death of others? Why has death, and largely murder, become so much of a spectacle for us, a form of entertainment?
Certo, ma anche se non morirai oggi, morirai più tardi. Questo stesso problema ti si porrà in ogni caso. Come affronterai allora questa terribile prova?
The first time I watched The Green Mile, I spent 2 of its 3-hour runtime just trying to figure out what it was about and where it was going. A little before that 3rd hour though, I fully got it. The Green Mile is a movie about death. Ignoring all the piss stuff, The Green Mile tells the story of prisoners on death row, and that looming threat of death never really goes away. The electric chair seems to loom large, maybe out of frame for just a second, but always there, always present just off screen. In one scene, one of the kinder prisoners is executed brutally. A guard who refused to see him as a person, an equal, someone worthy of respect, purposefully didn't wet the sponge that would have killed him quickly. Instead, he writhes in pain for several minutes, burning alive until the stench of death fills the room. The main question throughout the plot of the film is one of death. Who is going to die and who is going to make it out alive? The answers seem obvious at first. John Coffey, an innocent man, is going to somehow make it out because he's a good man who chose to try and do a good thing and was in the wrong place at the wrong time. William Wharton is going to die in the electric chair. Melinda Moore is going to succumb to her brain tumor. But none of these things happen. Wild Bill is shot to death in his cell, Melinda is healed by John, and John ultimately fries while onlookers jeer. At the end, we get the reveal that while our main character, Paul Edgecombe, is not technically immortal, he's going to live for a long time. He's lived so many years already, watched as everyone he's known and loved has suffered and died. He assures his nursing home partner that she too will die soon, and he'll still go on. The final note of horror here comes as he ponders just how long exactly he'll have to be alive for. Though death has been the catalyst for everything in this movie, the last terror of the film is that of the possibility of living forever, continuing on while everything else does not. Throughout the movie, we've been focused on the horror of death. But here, in its last moments, the film switches gears entirely, instead asking if that death is the very thing that makes life worth living. It's Such a Beautiful Day is a movie by animator Don Hertzfeldt. chronicling the life of a man named Bill as he lives through some sort of terminal illness. As the film continues on, Bill's life begins to spiral, becoming obsessed with memory, the past, and what comes after death. The movie itself begins to fall apart as the visuals become further and further detached from reality, almost unwatchable. Like The Green Mile, the ending is obvious. Bill is going to die. Likely with little bodily functions left, likely in a hospital, and likely having lost most of his memory. That threat is always there. Any moment now it could happen. Just a blink and Bill's life could end with almost no trace of it ever having started to begin with. Instead, the exact opposite happens.
It's such a beautiful day. Wait a minute. He's not gonna die. He's not gonna die. But he doesn't die. No. Bill, get up. Get up, Bill. Bill, get up. He can't. No, he's not gonna die. He can't ever die. Bill.
In the final minutes of the film, the story itself refuses. Bill's death is rejected, denied completely. Not only will Bill not die, he will continue on far into the future. He will take on hundreds of partners and watch as they all eventually suffer and die. He will watch as everyone and everything he has ever known and loved disappears. He will father thousands of children, and they too will all die before he does. He will be there when the world ends, when the earth takes its final breath, and he will be there long after, thousands and thousands of years after everything is gone. It's beautiful, but more so than that, it's absolutely terrifying. In the face of living forever, life ceases to have much in the way of meaning at all. In a way, both The Green Mile and It's Such a Beautiful Day become reflections of our collective fear. Not just of death, but also of what lies beyond it. Whether it's an afterlife, eternal consciousness, or the dread of absolute nothingness. The films invite us to confront the uncomfortable realities of both death and the final unknowable. Is it more terrifying to continue to exist forever than to live with the knowledge of death? Since we know our lives will one day end, what are we supposed to do with them? The Stranger is a novel which takes this to its logical conclusion. If we're all going to die one day, if we're nothing more than tiny little blinks on the cosmic scale, then none of it matters. The entire preposterous scheme means absolutely nothing as far as the cold indifference of the universe is concerned. Albert Camus, author of the book, described it as the nakedness of man faced with the absurd. It tells the story of Meursault, a man who shows little emotion towards the world as a whole. He pushes all of his feelings back, believing nothing matters, succumbing to a nihilistic worldview. He doesn't let himself truly live, seeing no value in it. He goes through his daily motions, living his life on autopilot, existing, but not really living. It isn't until right before his death that Meursault finally gets it, finally understands, regardless of if life has some predetermined meaning or not. It still has intrinsic value. I've spent many years of my life trying to contend with this type of worldview, find the balance between meaning and nothingness, the reality Camus deems absurd. It's hard to find reasons to continue once you face the reality of death, stare your mortality in the face. At the end of the day, it's likely that we won't really be remembered, maybe a few generations at most before it's like we never existed at all. The mainstream doesn't remember Candy Darling or Andy Warhol's famous group of superstars. No one's out there making Humphrey Bogart fan cams, but if you are, you should send them to me. Hell, even video games are dying out. The Video Game History Foundation reports that 87% of classic games are completely unplayable without piracy or the purchase of a lot of expensive, outdated equipment. Classic games, which, in this study, means anything released between 1960 and 2010. That availability rate is lower than silent films today. When even our art is being forgotten, is even up for debate if we're more than a tiny blip on the cosmic scale? It's like Whoville realizing their entire universe is nothing more than a speck on a clover. When you see that for what it is, realize the cold truth at the heart of the universe, that everything must eventually die, it's hard to find a reason to live. After The Stranger, Camus published an essay book, The Myth of Sisyphus, deemed by many to be his magnum opus. In it, he attempts to tackle what he considers to be the most important question in all of philosophy. The question of suicide. Of if there's any reason to live life. Camus ultimately decides that it doesn't matter if life has any meaning. He compares life to that of the myth of Sisyphus, stuck rolling a boulder up a hill for all of eternity. Every person out there is their own Sisyphus, and rolling that boulder is the act of living. It isn't always going to be easy. There's no promise that there will ever come a perfect time where nothing is ever wrong, where you have absolutely no reason to kill yourself. But in the words of Camus, there is no sun without shadow, and it is essential to know the night. The absurd man says yes, and his effort will henceforth be unceasing. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. There's no world in which we can just ignore the reality of death. But the cold finality of the end doesn't remove life of worth. If anything, it creates that worth. We're all going to die one day. But maybe accepting that fact and learning to make something more of our strange obsession with death is the first step towards finding those little reasons to keep going.